Here are the 7 biggest mistakes that new property investors make when buying their first property. When I bought my first couple of properties, I learned the hard way. I lost money, I made mistakes, and I lost a lot of time. So if you just watch this video, you'll be able to skip the trial and error and save yourself thousands of pounds in the process. So let's get into it. So the 7 mistakes that I'm going to talk about, they mainly consist of some of the mistakes I have made myself, the other mistakes I've just seen other people make and I've just thought, let's just avoid them. So if you watch this video, you'll have 7 things you'll be able to protect your downside, because property is one of those things that, yes, you can make a lot of money, usually thousands and thousands of pounds per property, but at the same time, if you do not do things correctly, you can end up losing thousands of pounds. The difference between making money and losing money in property, it all comes down to knowledge and education, right? So the very first thing that I always see people do is not researching enough. And when I'm talking about researching, that researching their local area or the place that they're looking to invest. And it's kind of crazy because I talk to quite a few people now who want to get into property, and they're like, okay, I want to get into property now. And I'm like, oh great, so what area are you looking to invest in? And they'll say something like, let's just say for example Birmingham, and I'll be like, okay, where in Birmingham, what's the rent like, what kind of ROI? And they just do not know these things, which kind of shocks me, because the very first thing you should be doing is, yes, you should be educating yourself, but you should have a handle or have a very good idea of the area that you're investing in, because there's a saying, isn't there, that money is made when buying a property, not selling. And when you're buying a property, yes, you are actually buying the house, but technically you're also kind of buying the area, as silly as it sounds. Hopefully that makes sense, because I always say this, that when you're buying a house, you can change that house, right? You can turn a shit house into a good house, but in most cases you yourself cannot turn a shit area into a good one, right? When you're deciding on an area, you really need to think of that. Does it have potential for growth, potential for value add? Will it make a return? And is there a demand? And these 3 things combined is what I would say makes a good area. And the thing is, all these things can be done literally just sitting in your room on a computer. So supply and demand, for example, you can simply just go on Rightmove and look at what kind of rents you're getting, right? So you literally have no excuses. Go on Rightmove, go on Zoopla, see what kind of, rents your properties can attract in that area. If you're still not sure, just give a letting agent a call, right? They're always there to help you. So that is pretty, you can solve that one quite easily. The second one is also need to understand that is there potential in that area. So the simplest way you can do that is, and there's 2 ways, I'll give you both ways, is one, you can just go on the local council website, right? There's always regeneration plans on the website. So that way you can see, okay, is there money being pumped into this area? Is there showing promise? Is there infrastructure around there? Is there more regeneration happening? So if you just have an educated guess around these things, you'll be able to see that actually my area, there's nothing much happening. There's no potential in that area. There's no potential for growth. And the second option, which I use myself rather than going on a council website, because I find like council websites, they're not very nice, right? It's not the best user experience. They don't really look great. It's hard to scroll around. So what I would do is, let's say I'm investing in Birmingham. Let's say in Birmingham, I'm investing in Solihull. This is what I would do. I'll go on Google, type in Solihull plus regeneration plans, development plans. And you can do that for every single area. And then you'll start seeing news articles, and those news articles will tell you that this is happening here, this is how much money is being invested. So these are the things that you really need to be understanding. And then the third thing is also understand what's around the area, what's in the area, the local amenities, hospitals. Is there good schools around it? If there are good schools, how do you determine what a good school is? Go on those schools and check what their Ofsted rating is. And again, it's one of those that the more effort you put in up front in researching the area, more confident you're going to be, and I promise you, the more money you're going to make. Because if you start investing your area and you really don't have a clue, I promise you, unless you get very lucky, in the future you will not make as much money as you potentially could by just investing 3-4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, no matter how many hours, even 10 hours, right, up front, and do all your research on the local market.
We'll get back to the video in a few seconds, but 70% of you watching this video aren't subscribed to my channel. Please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button and buy more properties in the next few months. I'll be sharing everything so you can learn from my mistakes for free Anyways, back to the video.
And the second mistake I feel like people make is overpaying for a property. Now, listen, I understand when you're new, you're eager, right? You're eager to get into the game. But you also need to understand this is your first property, right? If property doesn't go right for you the first time, it's most likely that you'll be put off by property, right? And then you're gonna think it's not gonna work for you. So it's really important when you're a beginner that to try and get a good head start, right? To get a good start in your property journey. And you can just do that by not overpaying for the property. So what do I mean by that? There's a lot of people who, instead of looking for motivated sellers, they become the motivated buyer, where they end up overpaying for a property just because they get emotionally involved, just because, oh, I want to get into property, I want to buy a property. That's not a good strategy, guys. You really need to keep your feelings aside and focus on the formulas, right? Because ultimately property is a numbers game. Can I make money from it? Yes or no? If you can't, move on. There's plenty of more, properties available, or there will be in the future. And this one can again easily be solved. All you need to do, you need to go on Rightmove or Zoopla, go on sold prices, check the history of the area, the properties, how much they've been selling for. I would really filter by sold in the past year, because the thing is, if you start looking at properties that were sold 2 years ago, it's not going to be an accurate reflection on what your property is worth now. So I always start with 1 year. If you can't find 1 year, then perhaps start broadening your filter out. But yeah, start with 1 year and then look what are the properties worth. So for example, if you know that there are 2 properties in your area that have sold for £400,000, for example, both of them 3-bedroom properties, then you can confidently say that, okay, I know that a 3-bedroom property within this area is going for around £500,000, and that way you're not overpaying for the property, and you're going to save yourself so much hassle, so much money, and that way you're actually going to be able to make more money as well. And another little tip is, and some of you probably know this, but those of you that don't, never ever offer with the asking price, right? I always start with the lower price, okay? Because you can always go higher, but when you've already offered your maximum, then it's almost impossible to win a bid by going lower, right? So always start lower and then incrementally increase your offer. You don't want to take the piss completely, right? You don't want to put an offer in like 4 or 5 times. Just have like your 3 bids, right? 1 is your lowest bid, 1 is your middle bid, and then 1 is your maximum price. But always stick to it. And overpaying for a property in auctions is probably even more likely to happen, because again, it's one of those adrenaline rushes. There's a bit of ego around in the auction rooms and stuff. So always have your final offer in mind and stick to it, guys. So the third mistake, admittedly, is one which I've made myself. So when you're new to property, unless you've got a bit of knowledge, there's 2 types of property investors when it comes to newbies. One is where they get put off by the property's condition. Okay, they think, oh, that's a lot of work, I don't want to touch that, that's not for me. And then the second one is someone like me that is okay with condition of the property, because they understand that the worse the condition of the property, the more value you can add. However, they also overlook the property's condition. So what I mean by that is that when I purchased my second property, I was like, okay, I know that I need to be buying properties that are in shit condition, because that's where you add value. That's where you can do the BRR strategy, which is buy, refurb, rent, and refinance. However, I overlooked many things. There's so many things that I can go through, but the main mistake I made was that I overlooked the condition of the roof, and that mistake ended up costing me £12,000. No one likes losing £12,000, right? It's costly, it hurts, and to be fair, that property still isn't really profitable for me because I've only had it a few years. Don't overlook the property's condition, okay? Just because it's in bad condition, just because you can make money off it, that does not mean that, oh, you should now buy it, because there's so many other things you need to look out for. You need to look at the damp, you need to look at the electrics, you need to look at the plumbing. There's so many things, and if you just want to avoid the mistakes, I have a checklist of 40 things that you need to go through when you're viewing a property. Just follow me on Instagram at I'm VJ Singh. DM me with the word view, and I'll send you the checklist for absolutely free, so that way you're not going to make that mistake. So the next one, this one actually isn't talked about enough. Now, most people understand that when you're buying a property, there will be costs associated with it, like your stamp duty, there'll be like, broker fees, and the main one being a refurb cost, right? Most people know that, but I think a lot of people underestimate the costs after purchasing the property. And of course, there's always a refurb cost, but there's so many other costs that you really need to account for, because if you don't, that could be like the difference between a good deal and not a good deal. So let's talk about them. The first one is voids. Now, depending on what strategy you have, some strategies will have less voids than others. So for example, if you've got a buy to let, your voids are, if you've done your research properly, your voids will be minimum. I'd probably account for like 5%, right? 5% voids. That's what I do. If you've got service accommodation, then you need to think about your occupancy, right? Because if you've got an occupancy of 70%, then that means you'll have voids of 30% technically, right? And then there's HMOs. HMOs also could have a lot of voids depending on, what kind of property is, and is it a student let, is it, there's so many variables. But the point is that you need to account for voids, because if you don't, then it's gonna hurt you, right? And on top of voids, there's also other costs that you need to account for. Maintenance costs, right? If you've got a property, you will have repairs. You will have repairs when you have a property. Even if you've refurbed the property and you think it's brand new, you will eventually have these costs. It could be something as simple like a cracked window, right? A cracked tile in the kitchen. It could be a new boiler. It could be a leaky shower. It could be a toilet that's blocked. There's so many little costs that you just do not account for, or you don't think of, but they will inevitably happen. And I don't want to put you off. The best way to do that is just account for it. Account for like 10% in your maintenance costs. Then apart from that cost, there's other costs to keep running the property. So if you've got a manager who's managing your property, you need to account for those costs as well, right? You need to account for insuring your property. You'll also probably need to account for other things like service charge if you've got like a flat. Just understand that your costs are not done after you've purchased the property, right? After you've refurbed the property. There are many other ongoing costs that you need to be accounting for. Gas certificates, EICR, which is your electrical installation condition report. You'll need that as well. So there are EPC certificate if you need to get one. So there are a lot of costs. Just account for them, and then that way you'll be better prepared. Better prepared, that means you're gonna have more certainty, and in the future you're gonna have a lot more profitable property. So when I was younger, my dad used to have a couple of buy-to-let investment properties, and he invested in the old way, right? Because that's what he was taught, or that's what he knew, right? Information wasn't available like on YouTube, books, and at that time. So he just did what he thought was best at the time. And I always used to remember that my dad, when he used to look for a tenant, he would try to find the tenant himself, right? And at the time, I didn't think this was out of the ordinary, right? Because that's what most people did. Most of the people I knew who invested in property at the time, that's what they did. And as a result, they would kind of like take anyone on who would be willing to pay for the property, which meant they really didn't do their due diligence on the tenants. And then naturally, what does that mean? That naturally meant that those tenants could just do anything. They used to leave all the time. I remember my dad used to having to keep finding tenants, and he'd have to keep going to the house, and he'd have to clean the property up, and then he'd have to fix all the mess that all the tenant left in. And then once he'd fixed the mess, then another tenant would come in. It was like a rotating conveyor belt of tenants. And the reality is, he could have just fixed that if you just get a managing agent. I didn't even know at the time there was a thing called like a manager agent. Like people would actually manage your property for a commission. So because if you just do that, that means if you get a good manager agent, they are just going to be able to do the job significantly better than you. Number one, they're going to know all the rules. Number two, they're going to know how to do all the due diligence on the tenant, do all the deeper checks, the credit history, have they been paying on time, what they're like as a tenant. And unless you know how to do these things, because you're not told these things, then you're going to struggle. That's why I use a property manager, because I'm leveraging their expertise and their knowledge so that I don't get these nightmare tenants. Guys, right now I have a portfolio of 20 properties, and I swear to God, right, I've been investing for like 4 or 5 years now. So far, I've never had problem tenant. That doesn't mean I'm not going to have one in the future, but the point is, if I was to manage those properties myself, I know for a fact I would have had a shit tenant by now, because I wouldn't have done my due diligence. So hire a managing agent. They're going to do all the due diligence for you. So for example, my management company, they use a company called Good Lord to do all the like back checks on the tenant. And this report is like 6-7 pages long, and the report will give you absolutely everything the management company needs to decide whether this is a good applicant for my property or not, right? So more of the stories, guys, just get a managing agent, right? Because if you start doing the due diligence on tenants, it's most likely you're not going to do a good job of it, and you're going to be put off by property. And again, it's one of those where you're going to say, oh, I got nightmare tenants. I get this on Instagram and TikTok and stuff like that quite a bit as well, that people always say, oh, but what if you get a bad tenant? What if you get this? What if you get that? The point is, it's very rare it happens. Like, I know a lot of property investors. Yes, it does happen, but it's not as much as the way people make out. And most of those people who are saying these things about nightmare tenants, I feel like either they're just saying it just to be annoying, or number two, if they have done it, it's most likely that they haven't done their checks properly. So out of all the 7 mistakes that I'm going to cover in this video, the next mistake I'm going to talk about is actually the one I completely understand why people do it, but let me tell you why it's actually not the right decision for the long run, right? So when you're new to business, when you're new to property, what most people think they should do is that they should try and do everything themselves, because that way they're going to cut all the expenses out. Low overheads means more profit. Completely understand. It's a very rational thing to do. However, in property investing, that is a slightly dangerous game to play, because the reality is if you're new to property or even in business, it's impossible for you to know everything, right? It's impossible for you to know how to view properties, find deals, then refurb properties, manage properties. It's just impossible, right? So as a result, when you do that, when you're new to property and you start doing all these things yourself, what's going to happen? You're either going to do a crap job for all of them, you're either going to burn yourself, or you're just either going to think, this is too much work for me, I hate property. And I've seen all those 3 things happen so many times. So the moral of this story is that do not do everything yourself. Get a power team. So what do I mean by power team? The first most obvious ones are obviously get a solicitor, right? That should be a no-brainer, because you don't know how to do the conveyancing process, right? But most people do the solicitor bit. The thing where most people struggle is the refurbs bit. I see so many people, they get inspired by Grand Designs, they watch all these videos, or they watch other Instagrammers do it, right? And they think, oh, I can have a go at that. It looks good, it looks fun. Let me tell you, if you do enough of these, it won't be fun anymore, right? And the main thing is that refurb is a very important part of the process, and if you've never done it before, you're going to take a lot longer. If it takes you longer, you're losing out on money, especially if you've got like a bridging loan to purchase the property or investor finance. That's one. Number two is the fact that if you start doing the DIY yourself, you're not focusing on the things that actually are going to make you money. Your focus should be on things like finding deals, raising investor finance, or making money in other ways, or even creating content. That's an income producing activity. A refurb is not. Another one where I see people try to take a bit of a shortcut, again, completely understand, they want to save that £300, £400, £500 off a mortgage broker fee. And a mortgage broker, from the outside, you think, oh, what do they do actually that's special? I could do that. Again, I thought that as well. But the thing is, a mortgage broker will have a lot more accessible products, a lot better products than you would, right? Because you won't have access to all of them, because you are not given access to all of them by the lenders, right? But if you're a broker, you'll have a network of these companies that will be able to offer you lower rates, and even a 0.2, 0.3% difference, right, in the interest rate. The saving you can make is going to supersede any of the mortgage broker fees that you're going to pay. So guys, always understand that property is a people's game, right? So you need to build a team of people that will help you get further in property, because if you really will have an ambition of buying multiple properties, building a portfolio, then it's very unlikely that you'll be able to do it alone, right? So get into the good habits of trying to build your power team from the start. A final one, which we've already talked about, is a management company. Try not to manage the properties yourself if you have like this thing, or if you have this ambition of building a portfolio. And I know some people will counter argue that, oh, I want to learn this myself first and then I'll expand, or let me save some money first, let me make some money, then I'll expand. But I think that's like a short-sighted way of looking at things, because you should not be thinking, how can I save money? You should be thinking, how can I make more money? And if you start thinking, how can I make more money, then managing the properties yourself is not the solution. I'm gonna finish off the last one by another mistake that I made, and probably the biggest mistake I made in my first property, which was buying the wrong property. Now, not all properties are equal. Is investing in average property better than not investing at all? Yes, over long term, 100%. But again, it comes back to if you just put a bit more effort into researching, understanding what's good and not, just for those 5, 6, 10 hours, no matter how many hours it's going to take you, if you just put the work in up front, you're going to again make a lot more money. So what do I mean by that? My personal example, when I bought my first property, I bought a new build, right? New builds are a no-no. Why new builds are a no-no is a completely different story. But the point of the thing is that there are certain types of properties that do not make the best property investment, right? And yes, they will still make you money, but they're not the best. So what kind of properties are those? New builds, and then flats, and then leasehold properties, and then there's shared ownership. You really need to be avoiding these properties. Also, on top of new builds, properties already in good condition, you know, like these turnkey properties. Can they still make money? Absolutely. Can you make more money by not buying these properties? 100%. And I know some people will buy a certain type of property simply because they cannot afford the other property. So for example, I know a lot of people, when I ask them why did you buy a flat, they'll say because it's more affordable than a normal house, or I bought a shared ownership because that's all I could afford. And yeah, again, it's a rational way of thinking this, I understand. But if you want to be a property investor, you cannot think like, oh, what can my budget allow me to do? You need to think, well, is this the best kind of investment? Because if you know you can make more money by investing in a house or investing in a property in a poor condition, for example, compared to like a brand new property, then as an investor, you need to put your investor's hat on. You need to think, okay, I know this is better for me, then how do I try to make this happen? That's the approach I would take. And it's not just even an ROI perspective, it's also, you need to understand, is this property going to be good for my tenant? Because it's ultimately a tenant who's going to pay you, right? So you also have to have the tenant in mind. And on top of that, on top of the ROI and on top of what the tenant wants, you also need to think about the future, right? What will this property be worth in 20 years time? What can I sell it for then? Because if you're buying a flat, for example, then it's almost certain that like a like for like flat compared to a house in terms of, you know, price. So for example, if you've got £100,000 flat, you've got £100,000 property, then in most cases, if they're in the same area, a house will always appreciate more. You can make a lot more money from a house than a flat, right? Because you've got more potential at value add. The tenants will want to stay in there longer. Usually flats are seen as stepping stones, but it's not just flats. There's other things like we've already talked about, shared ownership and that. So just understand that you need to be investing in the right kind of properties, that make an investment property. Do not get a residential property mixed up with investment property. They are both completely different. Both have to approach them with a different mindset. So now that you understand that there are certain type of properties that you need to be avoiding, what I'm going to do, I'm going to put up a video called 6 properties to avoid, and go watch that video. That way you'll have a better idea and the reasons behind why these properties are not the right kind of property for property investing. Go watch that video, subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you soon.